In a year that's been absolutely wild and controversial, the Detroit Pistons offseason has been no different. 2020 has seen the departure of fan favorites, the arrival of young talent, and big free agent signings. Bottom line, things changed. Just take a look at the starting lineup. In the 2019-2020 season, the crew that got the most starts for the Pistons was Blake Griffin, Bruce Brown, Andre Drummond, Luke Kennard, and Tony Snell. Reggie Jackson would have started over Brown at point, but he was dealing with injuries. Again. In 2020-2021, the starting lineup will most likely look like this. Blake Griffin, Killian Hayes, Mason Plumlee, Jeremy Grant, and DeLon Wright. Although I wouldn't be surprised if Sekou Doumbouya took over for Wright later in the season. So where'd the starters go? All of them traded away. Except Reggie. They paid him to get out of town. Detroit, after more than a decade of mediocrity, has gotten younger and is looking towards the future instead of the now. Last season, the team's average age was just over 26 years old, which was good enough for 18th youngest in the NBA. However, this year, the average age of the Pistons is down to 24.9 years old, which moved them up to 7th in the league. To really put things into perspective, from last season to this one, only 4 Pistons are returning. Griffin, Derrick Rose, Sekou Doumbouya, and Yes. Oh, and Griffin's the only one of the 4 that has played more than 2 full seasons in Detroit. So how'd the Pistons get here? I present to you the store. During this part of the video, I'm going to list all the moves the Pistons made to acquire someone or something new. So I'm not going to talk about every single transaction they made this offseason, but you'll get to see all the movement that took place. This is meant to overwhelm you, so don't worry. I'll be breaking down the most important stuff after this. June 18th, 2020. The Pistons signed Troy Weaver to be their GM for the next 4 years. November 18th, draft night. Detroit Pistons take French point guard Killian Hayes with the number 7 pick. An announcement is also made that the Pistons have traded for the 16th, 19th, and 38th picks as well. This nets them Isaiah Stewart, Saddiq Bey, and Saben Lee. November 19th. The deal with LA and Brooklyn is finalized. Detroit gets Bey, Jalen Hands, Janin Musa, and draft consideration from the Nets, and Rodney McGruder and cash from the Clippers. In return, the Pistons send Luke Kennard, Justin Patton, and 4 second-round picks to LA, and Bruce Brown to Brooklyn. November 20th. Detroit trades the 4th of their 5 starters, Tony Snell and Kyrie Thomas, to the Hawks for Dwayne Dedmon. They ultimately waived and stretched Dedmon to save money. November 22nd. The Pistons complete a sign-and trade, bringing Jeremy Grant to the Motor City for $60 million over 3 years, and Nikola Radicevich for cash. Detroit also completed their trade with the Jazz to get Saben Lee and Tony Bradley for cash. November 23rd. The Pistons signed Anthony Lamb to a non-guaranteed contract. He was later cut during the preseason. On the same day, Detroit sent Tony Bradley, the same Tony Bradley they got 24 hours ago, to the 76ers for Zahir Smith. They immediately waived and stretched him to save a minimal amount of cash. November 24th. The trade with Houston is finalized, and Isaiah Stewart, Trevor Ariza, a future second-round pick, and cash come to Detroit for Christian Wood and a protected first-round pick for next year. November 27th. In a 3-team trade, the Pistons decided Trevor Ariza was a veteran in Detroit after 3 days and shipped him off to OKC and got DeLon Wright from the Mavs. December 1st. Not only did the Pistons sign their 4 major draft picks, they also signed Mason Plumlee for $25 million over 3 years, Jahlil Okafor for 2 years, Josh Jackson for $9.8 million over 2 years, and Davidas Servides for 3 years. December 2nd. The Pistons signed Wayne Ellington for 1 year and $2.5 million. They also decided to non-guarantee LiAngelo Ball, but waived him before he played a single second in the preseason due to a high ankle sprain. Lost? Good. Now, before we get into the major trades and signings, we have to talk about Troy Weaver. He was hired by Detroit to replace GM Ed Stefanski. Last year, the Pistons won only 20 games in a shortened season, and the year before they finished 500 and were swept by the Bucks in round 1. So, who is Troy Weaver? Well, to give you some background, he started his basketball career by forming the DC Assault in the Amateur Athletic Union and acted as their head coach from 1993 to 1996. During that span, the Assault went 85-17 and won the Tournament of Champions in 1996. A few years later, he became the assistant coach for Syracuse in 2000. He was part of the 03 team that won the NCAA championship with Carmelo Anthony, who he heavily recruited, by the way. By 2004, he became the head scout of the Jazz and was eventually promoted to director of player personnel for the 07-08 season. The next season, he was hired to be the assistant GM of OKC. And he wasn't shy when he got there. He immediately pushed to draft a player with the number 4 overall pick that wasn't even considered elite coming out of college. Most would have laughed at Weaver for wasting the 4th pick. As it turns out, that player won the MVP and is a 9-time All-Star. The player's name? Russell Westbrook. Oh, and the next season, Weaver helped draft another future MVP named James Harden to go along with their 3rd MVP, Kevin Durant. How did they not win a championship with that team? Weaver was promoted to Vice President of Basketball Operations and served in that role until the end of last season. So, just to recap, Troy Weaver created a basketball team that he coached to an 85-17 record and a championship in just 3 seasons. He joins Syracuse's staff, heavily recruits Carmelo Anthony, and then they win the national championship. He was then hired by the Jazz as a head scout and was rapidly promoted to director of player personnel. Then he went to the Thunder and drafted 2 future MVPs to go along with their current MVP. It's safe to say he knows winning basketball. Alright, on to the players. First up, Killian Hayes. I mentioned earlier that the Pistons took him 7th overall in the 2020 draft. This wasn't a shot in the dark. The Pistons haven't had a great point guard since Chauncey Billups back when Detroit won their last championship. So it makes sense that the Pistons went after who many considered to be the best point guard in the draft, and some even considered him to be the best player in the draft. Hayes played in Germany and France as a semi-pro, and his team won the gold medal in 2017 FIBA U16 European Championship. He just so happened to be the MVP that year. The next year his team won silver in the FIBA Under-17 World Cup. Oh yeah, did I mention that he's only 19? While he's not the fastest point guard ever to hit the hardwood, his size at 6'5", 195 allows him to take some contact on the way to the rim. His shooting needs some work, but he's an excellent passer with a very high ceiling. He could be everything the Pistons were looking for, or he could be a bust. Only time will tell. Now let's talk about the biggest move the Pistons made, at least size-wise. Detroit completed a 3-team trade with the Nets and Clippers. Here's a look at all the movement that took place. I want to focus on just a couple players though. First off, the Pistons sent away 2 starters in this trade, Bruce Brown and Luke Kennard. Both are very young players with potential. However, in Brown's 2 seasons in Detroit, he was far from great, even though he started a majority of the team's games. Like I said, he's got potential, but he's not playing mini minutes at all with his new team, so it's gonna be a while before we can make conclusive decisions about him. As for Kennard and his luxurious, beautiful, 24-year-old hair, he's been in the NBA for 3 years. He's a terrific shooter that came into his own last season, albeit injury shortened. The Clippers think so highly of Kennard that they just extended him for 4 years and $64 million. So why get rid of such a valuable player? The answer is in the question: value. The Pistons save a tremendous amount of money by shipping Kennard to LA, and while they're reshaping their team, that's incredibly important. And we haven't even talked about their returns yet. In this deal, the Pistons got the 19th pick in the draft, Saddiq Bey. A 2-year player out of Villanova, Bey is a pretty typical 3-and-D player, but he shot over 45% from beyond the arc last season. Reminds me of a Duke player I used to know. So did Detroit just get a younger, less developed Kennard? No. Bey is 6'8", which is significantly taller than Kennard's 6'5". Not to mention he shot even better from 3 in college, and he's way better on the defensive end. Last season, Bey allowed .56 points per ISO possession, which was in the 76th percentile in college basketball. Not bad for a slow forward. Even though Kennard is thought of highly by his new team, Bey may have an even higher ceiling at a much lower price for the next few seasons. Also, buried in this trade, the Pistons got Rodney McGruder, a player who shoots a very high percentage from all over the floor. He just doesn't put up a ton of total shots. The Pistons also got cash and draft consideration to help boost the deal's value. The other major trade Detroit made was with Houston. Here's a look at all the movement. This is probably the Pistons' most controversial deal. They give up a lot of talent for essentially an undetermined amount in return. The first piece of this trade that needs to be noted is Christian Wood. He bounced around the league before he got to Detroit last season, and he never really found himself in the NBA until he got a lot of playing time last year. It was his breakout performance. From a purely statistical standpoint, you can tell he's an effective power forward. He can score and rebound, but he can also shoot the three very well for a big man. I mean, just look at this effective field goal percentage. It's so beautiful. However, the most important part of Wood's game doesn't really show up on the stat sheet. He's what I like to call a fire starter. See what I mean? Now you understand why Pistons fans didn't want to see him go. However, with a performance like Wood's in 2019-2020, compensation is demanded. Once he got to the Rockets, he immediately signed a 3-year, $41 million contract, making him more than 13 times more expensive per year. Again, Detroit is trying to save money in this rebuild. Another part of the deal of note was that the Pistons traded a top 16 protected first-round pick as well. So if Detroit performs well enough to be in the top 18, Houston will take their pick, which the Pistons could certainly use. However, the returns are interesting. The Pistons got Trevor Ariza, who they quickly shipped off to OKC, I see you, Weaver, and got DeLon Wright from Dallas. Wright is an underrated get by Detroit. He's their starting shooting guard and a veteran presence on a very young team, not to mention he can shoot from anywhere, and he's good on the defensive side as well. But the big question mark in this trade is the number 16 draft pick, Isaiah Stewart. Stewart played 1 year at Washington before declaring for the NBA draft. He put up some pretty good numbers at the center position. The problem? He's only 6'9". He's also not a great scorer away from the basket. To make things seem worse, he's now a third-string center when he was taken in the middle of the first round. But there is upside. What Stewart lacks in height, he makes up for in strength, wingspan, and energy. He's 250 pounds of pure muscle. His wingspan is 7'4", or 7 inches more than his height. He's also incredibly active. In the little NBA time I've seen him play, he's out-hustled the opposition, and I've seen him jump as many as 3 times for a rebound before anyone else has even jumped once. Also, I'd like to point out that Stewart shot 77.4% from the free throw line. A great number for a center. This shows that he has the potential to develop a good shot from the floor. Free throw percentage in college is actually a better indicator of how someone will shoot from 3 in the NBA than their 3-point percentage is. This means that Stewart could be a threat from down low and from distance with time. Finally, we have to talk about the free agent signings. After trading away Drummond and Wood last season, the Pistons needed to go out and get themselves a center. So they went out and got Mason Plumlee? They signed Plumlee for $25 million over 3 years. He served most notably as Nikola Jokic's backup for the Nuggets, and he's pretty good for a backup, but as a starter, he leaves a lot to be desired. He's not a good shooter away from the rim, and he isn't very aggressive when he's in the post either. On defense, he's not very quick and not very active. However, Plumlee is a great passer and maybe the best on the team, and when he chooses to engage offensively, he can be a force. He also can catch the offense off guard and get a few swipes if they aren't careful. Not to mention his size allows him to disrupt any shot near the rim. On top of that, the Pistons got Jahlil Okafor for 2 years. He was part of the 14-15 Duke National Championship team, and he was drafted 3rd overall in 2015. He hasn't quite lived up to his potential, but he also hasn't seen good minutes since 2016-17. He will have a chance to prove himself as the Pistons' backup. Speaking of high draft picks that still have potential, Detroit signed Josh Jackson for $9.8 million over 2 years. Jackson played his college ball for Kansas and was drafted 4th overall in 2017. Since entering the NBA, he's had his troubles, but last year in the Memphis G League, Jackson tore it up. And he's continued that production in his first few games with Detroit, which is his hometown by the way. both Jackson and Okafor are low-risk, high-reward signings for the Pistons that could have a huge impact. But the biggest signing for Detroit was Jeremy Grant for 3 years and $60 million. He went off in the playoffs last season, and he played great defense against the likes of AD and LeBron. He was reportedly offered the same contract by Denver, but he decided playing time was more important than winning, and he wanted to step up his game even more. This is a great sign by the Pistons, assuming Grant stays healthy. Otherwise, he'd be a remarkably similar story to you-know-who. I believe this was a great offseason for Detroit. For the first time since their 2004 championship, they're taking a step back so in the future they can take 2 steps forward. There is a lot of young talent on this team, and I wouldn't be surprised if Weaver was very active at the trade deadline this year. The Pistons are finally headed in the right direction.